Thank you, everybody, especially for hanging around for the final presentation of the day. So I want to build on some of the topics that have already been talked about today, but I think as just alluded to in that last conversation there's big challenges, people struggling with where to start with Scope 3, for example, and against an economic backdrop where everyone's considering cost. I'm very nervous of what's happening in terms of sustainability initiatives. Some people are quietly withdrawing, others more publicly. I saw Iceland this summer step back from some of their commitments around palm oil, for example, because basically said the economics don't work at the moment. So I'm going to take the next 20, 25 minutes to talk through 4 practical areas of thinking about this, of changing the discussion and why sustainability doesn't always have to cost. So I want to start with this gentleman. Hopefully many of you in the room will recognise the great Sir David Attenborough, archaeologist, naturalist, activist. Lighten the mood a little bit, also an entrepreneur. He grew up in Leicester, my home city. His father was the dean at Leicester University, and when the chemistry and research department needed newts for their research, he took the job of fulfilling that in an entrepreneurial way and selling them their own newts from the university grounds at 3 old pence a newt. Not sure how sustainable that was, but I do love it. You have to love the guy. Arguably, he's done more to raise awareness around sustainability than almost anybody in terms of bringing it into our homes. And that was very striking with Blue Planet. They're on Frozen Planet now. But Blue Planet took the issues to a global audience, tens of millions of people, raised the issues of things like ocean plastic. And that Blue Planet effect was enormous in terms of getting people to talk about plastic. It also changed behaviour. They didn't just talk about it, they wanted to know more about it, they wanted to ask more questions. They actually changed behaviour. You could see less sea plastic arriving on beaches. And it forced organisations and corporations to act as well. So, was that all good? Maybe not. I'm not going to argue with Sir David too much, but part of the effect was driving people to different sorts of packaging. Plastic became evil. But actually, if you look at the carbon impact of plastic, it's very efficient. That's why it's so prolific. And if it's moving people out of plastic and into things like aluminium and glass, they have a different carbon impact. I'm not going to get into which is better. It depends on your use. Glass can be arguably infinitely recyclable, aluminium more so. Then aluminium cans most have plastic inside to stop us getting aluminium poisoning. The reason I put it up here is actually there is no one silver bullet. There is no one solution. People need to actually look and say, yes, this is an issue, but now what do I do? One of the other impacts was a commercial impact. So we saw the impact on cardboard prices. I predict we're going to see even more happening with this because a little talked about thing is how much of the wood pulp that ultimately turns into packaging actually comes from Russian forests or won't be given current embargoes. So ultimately I put that up as saying, a blind dash in a particular direction. So plastic is bad, we must get rid of plastic, isn't always a good thing. It isn't always a good thing in terms of cost. It was very striking, for example, how black plastic trays became the devil and everybody committed to get rid of black plastic. Black plastic was recyclable. Actually, we'd put as much effort into making sure it was recycled, arguably we'd be better than when we banned it. So we've got to avoid a bad dash, but we can't do nothing either. We've seen all sorts of impacts this year. Seen record floods recently in America with Storm Ian, which seems the tamest name for a storm. I mean, surely we could have gone with Ivan, given what Russia's doing at the moment. We've seen half of Pakistan flooded. We need to act, and I regularly go back to this quote from Barack Obama. I'm not being political, he just said it very succinctly. We're the first generation to feel the effect of climate change. It's irrefutable. But we're the last generation who can do something about it. So commercially, what does that mean? These are some of the things this year talking about heatflation. We've seen with record temperatures across Europe, just read the numbers for yourself, the impact on animal feed, food production, fruit production. This isn't all happening off in some far-off land. This is happening here in Europe, based on current climate prediction happening, which is years before predicted. So my first takeaway is about reframing the conversation around the C-suite. It isn't, should we be doing these sustainable things, right? I think the previous interview, some honest, why are people doing it? Are they trying to mitigate costs, etc.? This one is, you've got to mitigate risk. We have limited resources. These events are driving up costs across complex supply chains. So actually, it might feel that you're paying a little more with that fraction of a cent per bottle, but actually, the risk and impact to your business, the economics stand up. Slightly less well-known gentleman, possibly. Anybody know this man? This is T.G. Ono. I think that's how you pronounce it. He was famous for the Toyota production system. He brought in what many of us have now embraced in lean manufacturing, and that Toyota production system was all about efficiency. We brought in again, EDI was mentioned earlier, that actually came on the back of just in time, which came on the back of the Toyota manufacturing system. It's not all perfect. Arguably, the lean nature of our supply chain is part of what caused challenges in the recent pandemic. We'd focused too much on efficiency at the expense of resilience. But one of the key parts about that was waste, removing waste. The reason Toyota became so successful was removing waste. And when I qualified as an engineer 30 years ago, as hard as that is to believe, all of the talk was around resource efficiency. Put simply, using our limited resources in a sustainable manner while minimising the impact. So that's about as, waste costs, waste time costs, waste material costs, doing things twice costs. Ultimately, if you focus on resource efficiency, you're focusing on cost. So if you're focusing on being more sustainable through resource efficiency, you're also focusing on reducing costs. So I'd say, let's go back to the good old days to some extent and rediscover that term resource efficiency. A couple of really simple examples just to bring it to life. This one here in the UK, and Waitrose, now I believe Aldi, Sainsbury's, others have done the same, taken the coloured plastic cap off our milk and replaced it with a clear one, which is of the same recycled material, can be recycled with the bottle, it's made with recycled content, the whole thing is more recyclable, it's more cost effective, so it's good for the planet, it's good for business. The only reason we had a coloured cap was to make it a little bit easier to spot the item on the shelf, and when you've got a really big blue label, I'm not really sure you need a little blue cap on top as well. What I do think is striking was the fact that the length of the successful trial that actually led to that. I'd like to argue that it was the right thing to do and it shouldn't have needed a trial, it should have just been telling people, here's why we're doing it. Another simple example here in the UK is the removal of best before dates from a lot of fresh produce. We have a global food surplus. We throw about a third of all the food that is produced. We're all paying for that food to be produced, both in money and carbon. We're still digging up forests, planting new fields, etc. We have 35% global overproduction of food. It's just going to the wrong places, going to waste, throwing away perfectly good fruit and vegetables because there's an artificial best before date is a good example. So Waitrose, I think it was one of the largest commitments recently of 500 plus lines. Sainsbury's, when they announced 270 lines, but Sainsbury's also estimated that's 17 million items not being thrown away. So hopefully a good example of why it's good for the environment, it's good for business. There's a expression in sport, which is winning's about the top 2 inches. Thinking, get that brain thinking. I love my sport metaphor, but this is actually simpler than that. Simple comparison I did between an American cereal box and an English cereal box. Almost identical weights, 500 grams, 18 ounces, they're very, very similar. There's 37% more volume in an American box because they make it bigger to make it look better on the shelf. That's more space, that's more freight, that's more fuel. It's 22% wasted packaging. at a time where I showed you what's going on with packaging. So it's about thinking differently about these things to drive change. And then bringing it back to the commercials. What do customers most value? Recent research by Deloitte, it's not our commitment to be carbon zero by 2040. It's not these pledges that most people on the street can't relate to. The number one thing they relate to is sustainable products and sustainable packaging. So if you focus on resource efficiency, focus on this impact, you're also focusing on the product that customers want to buy. So, second takeaway, rediscover resource efficiency. Change the debate, focus on less materials, less waste. It might be an item that's still not recyclable, but if I'm using less of it, that's still better. But we have an Olympic-sized challenge. We've already exceeded 5 out of our 9 planetary boundaries. So by metrics, that means 5 things we're consuming is more than the Earth's producing every year. Earth Overshoot Day, which basically measures when have we used 1 Earth's worth of consumption, has gone from December in 1970 to now July. By July every year, we've already used more than 1 Earth's production. So it's a massive challenge, which I agree we're not going to solve by taking the top 2 inches off a cardboard box. What we do need to do is we need to do lots of these little things together where we're looking at these trade-offs between the environmental, the economic, etc. So my third inspiration is this gentleman, Sir David Brailsford. He was the GB Olympic coach. He inherited an English cycling team who'd basically not medalled since about 1908. He went right back to basics, dissected everything that they did, and said, there is no silver bullet. But if I make the helmet slightly more aerodynamic, if I make the tyres slightly less friction, I take all of these little elements of marginal gains, and that's the expression, it's marginal gains theory. If I take all of these things together, they accumulate to have a big impact. And he took that to extremes. They worked out that the dust in the vans where they were working on the bikes was enough to have an impact. He put all those things together and brought about a record set of wins for us in 2008, 2012. Us, I wasn't in the cycling team, I'm just being patriotic. But he took them on that journey, record-breaking performance, all through those marginal gains, and sharing that knowledge. So this was about lots of people involved, lots of things. So I think most people at the time saw the velodrome, it was great, it got lots of television, but those were shared across BMX, road racing, etc. It resulted in something like 59 World Championship golds across that period of time, and lessons we can apply in any part of business. So I spoke at the sister event, Sustainability Live, last month on this, so I'm doing this briefly. If everyone's quick enough, that code might actually take you to the presentation on this in more detail. It's also available from our website. But applying this 1% rule, applying these marginal gains, is taking the fact we have many people in our supply chain, and if we can activate all of those, where for many sat in the room, 90% of our sustainability impact exists. Research from McKinsey says we have a 24 times greater impact by working with that supply chain than working on our own organisations. And supply collaboration is essential to driving that gain. So if we take something like emissions, I need to reduce emissions, but if I only focus on my direct emissions, my scope 1, my scope 2, it's not going to get me there. The next step, most people always work with their strategic suppliers, because a small number of suppliers will apply for the largest thing. It still doesn't get us there. And if we wait to then engage the rest of the supply chain, we don't get there fast enough. We're already seeing climate change quicker than the forecasts. We need to be engaging all suppliers now, getting those marginal gains across the entire supply chain, getting those shared learnings across the entire supply chain, so that we can scale that performance. So, takeaway number 3 from today, I'd like you to leave is this idea of scaling performance through supplier engagement. Again, it came up in the talk previously, it's important about getting stakeholders involved, going beyond bold sourcing policies of I will not use black plastic anymore or whatever it might be, to actually say, what is the goal I really want to do? How can we creatively solve this? how can we do all these little things like changing the cap on my milk bottle and taking the best before dates off and taking the top 2 inch off a carton and adding all of those things together to have an incremental impact now that creates ripples across the whole supply chain, in addition to some of the big, more transformative projects that are being done with key suppliers. I'm going to stick with Teiichi Ono for my fourth one. The other part of his manufacturing process was he basically used a thing called Kaizen, which simplistically translates to continuous improvement. Very similar to Sir David Brailsford's approach on the cycling, it about taking everything and breaking everything down to its component parts and saying, what are all the issues? What do I do? How can I scale this change over time? It was an important part of the Japanese resurgence post-World War II. Important part of that learning was, I'm not going to try and say Japanese, but was do not let perfect get in the way of better. I think that's very applicable to a lot of these things in sustainability. There are many circles who argue we need huge transformative projects, but actually don't know what the answer is, and that results in inertia. We need those projects, and we need this continuous improvement, things like the resource efficiency I've already alluded to. So I want to share this very simple 6-step process we use at Supply Pilot. We've embedded it in our tool, but you can use it in any way. It basically starts with making sure you understand the material issues for your business, for your brands, for your products. From that, defining SMART goals where you can engage the readiness of your suppliers. So if you have a SMART goal, you can validate that goal, that your suppliers can actually meet you on that. You need to meet the suppliers where they are on the journey, but also making sure they're then ready to move with you, and then benchmarking them against that goal so you can form strategy. That's the first step for basically any project we do, is making sure you've got an engaged audience, you understand the barriers, you understand the obstacles. Step 4 and 5 are about going through that continuous improvement process. So you'll see the little loop between 4 and 5. Going out and activating suppliers, saying, here's where we're going and why, here's what we need to do, here's the tools to do it. Now come back, tell me what you've done. You're not going to solve it all overnight, so basically one product at a time, I'm going to increase the recycled content or make it recyclable. I'm going to look at these simple changes. I'm going to take the unnecessary plastic window off a quiche carton. I'm going to take all of those incremental steps to achieve that goal. So I can say, actually, so in 2025, I achieved my plastic pack commitment because people phased through it. So you're taking them through that against the right targets. So it's about aligning and activating your suppliers very clearly, not just you must do this, right? This is about engagement, not just management. It's supply management with a little m and a big E for engagement, right? It doesn't work if you take the big stick approach. You need to be going, come on this journey with us. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're doing, one step at a time, make it accessible, empower people and move forward, but then still hold them accountable. At the end of the day, you've made the commitment, you're going through that loop, you're collecting the information. They need to make sure they're taking the strides with you that you've agreed. So, number 4, hopefully bring the word Kaizen more into our everyday lives, talking about this continuous improvement, and as Voltaire said, do not let perfect be the enemy of good. Do not let the fact that it seems surmountable stop us starting the journey today. So, to recap those 4 things. You need to keep your sustainability plans on track because of an uncertain economy, not allow them to be derailed because of a fear of an uncertain economy. You need to mitigate those supply risks, you need to mitigate the material risks, you need to mitigate the costs that will come with that, and therefore focus not just on today's product cost, but actually on the total cost of what's happening in the supply chain. Reframe some of the sustainability debate away from it's a cost in sustainability, rather than actually there's a saving through resource efficiency. I presented at an event last week, and some of the case studies there, every manufacturer said, they surprised themselves by the fact by the time they'd actually come through with a new sustainable product, it was cheaper. But it's a mindset that you need when you're going into the discussion. How do you make that happen? You scale that performance through the supplier engagement. Don't just focus on discussions with those few key suppliers. Get all of your suppliers on that journey with you. If your biggest suppliers are saying it's going to take them until 2035 or 2040 to make some of these impacts, they started 10 years ago. How long is it going to take your smaller suppliers? We need to get them all started and all moving now. But remember, it's about continuous improvement. Do not let perfect be the enemy of good. So I kind of blamed Sir David Attenborough a little bit at the start, but I do want to finish with another quote from him, which was from COP26 last year, which if working apart we're a force that could create this destabilised planet we're in today, and surely working together, we're powerful enough to save it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Really interesting session to end the day on. I've got a few questions, and I know I've got a few here. Are there any questions from the audience? If you do have one, please throw your hand up, and we'll get a mic out to you. Okay, the first question I wanted to ask, actually, is, and don't take this the wrong way, this all looks great, but you know, there's a cost of living crisis in this country and many countries around the world right now. So does that make all these sustainability efforts less important? Is it purely down to cost of the product for the consumer?
I think there's two things. I think firstly, there continues to be research that said the majority of consumers are still prioritising sustainable purchases where they can. So it's still important to them. Right? But it's this whole point. If you're doing resource efficiency, you should say it doesn't necessarily cost. If I can take the little plastic window off my quiche box, I'm probably going to save 15% on the cost of that pack. It's also not using certain resources, so it'll be simpler to make. It's also definitely more recyclable and more likely to be recycled because people are not sure what to do with it. So it's a win-win. It's actually changing that old paradigm of kind of going, well, you know, do I really need to see the quiche inside that I've bought for the last however long? So if people are happy to think differently, there's all sorts of things that go directly to addressing that cost of living crisis. I think what's wrong is that brands aren't always bringing consumers on the journey. So for me, you don't just take that window off and go, oh, I'll just put another picture of quiche on there. Actually put something in the window that says, we've taken this off because you know the product's great and we've just saved this much. And that really appeals to people at the point of purchase, which is the best way you can influence. So I don't think I think that's really the whole point here is, don't worry about it. I say, actually, this goes to both ends. I can be more sustainable and addressing those requirements.
And I suppose that brings me to my second question, which it was the example you used of the cereal boxes, in the US, for instance. Now, at first glance, I do this for sure if I'm at a supermarket, and if I see a big box of cereal rather than a smaller box of cereal, I'll think that one is better value if the prices are comparable or whatever. So surely that's me, on a very basic level, making a decision based on size of box. So if you were to, I don't know if you got evidence that backs this up, but if those cereal companies did reduce the size of those boxes by 22% or whatever, would that negatively impact sales, or did they have to shout about its sustainability benefits?
So firstly, that's exactly the reason it is the size it is. I'm pleased to say we've got European legislation that makes it harder to do that over here. So whether people did it for the right reason or legislation, I wasn't aware at the time, to be perfectly honest. But they don't have the equivalent legislation in North America. But for me, again, it's actually an opportunity that says, so, if I was the marketeer, I wouldn't just do that. I'd make sure I've told the customer. I'd say, buy this box. It's got the same as the thing next to it. It's also more environmentally friendly, and you're not paying these guys extra money for some empty space. Now, clearly, first person does that's an opportunity. Others can't do that, but it's about talking to the consumer, bringing that to life. That's why it costs nothing to actually change your packaging for a couple of months and actually, literally visually tear it and say, we're tearing the top off this pack because we've realised it's waste, so in 2 months' time it'll be smaller. I now want to buy that pack. But you're absolutely right. If you do it and there's research, I'm going to apologise, I can't remember the origin of the research, but they reckon the top 3 retailers in the UK have left about $8 billion worth of sales on the table by not telling consumers what they're doing. So for me, it's all about the communication.
Okay, all about communication. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I've got one more question for you before we bring this day to an end then. Now, a lot of businesses are overcome with a sense of inertia due to the breadth and complexity of sustainable supply chain issues facing their business. So what single piece of advice would you give businesses who are struggling to get started on that journey?
The really trite answer is get started. Yeah, the longest journey starts with the first step, or whatever the famous expression is. But I think this inertia is coming from, I've got to solve this. I need this huge transformational thing. So if I can tell it just as a simple example of biodiversity, for example. Biodiversity, unlike a lot of these things, it's difficult to measure. There is no legislation yet, it's coming. There's no global standard. And therefore, how am I going to measure it? It's one thing I do disagree with. I don't think it's all about the data, which is some people have said. Just go to all of your suppliers and say, this is what it matters, this is what it is, please tell us one thing you'll do next year. You've got 3,000 suppliers, that's probably 2,500 suppliers who've done one thing to improve biodiversity next year. Just get started. Keep it simple, keep it pragmatic. It's marginal gain theory.
Okay, just get started and marginal gain theory. Thank you so much for the session, James. Thank you.
Thank you.